Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this meeting of Sarawak Postal History. It's well attended with, according to the note on the foot of my screen, there's 130 participants, which is very, very good indeed. May I particularly welcome Claire, Martin-Redman, James and Richard, Simon's two sons. And also members of the Sarawak Specialist Society. Simon, I have one apology for absence from Frederick Lawrence in the United States, that he's unable to link in this afternoon, but I have already advised him that the meeting is being, and your presentation is being recorded, and he will be able to see it online later on. I've no announcements to make, despite the fact that I think the government have indicated the tiers in which the relevant or parts of the country will be from the 2nd of December, although I'm happy to say that all boroughs of London will be in tier 2 rather than in tier 3. Mark has already mentioned that if you have questions, please use the chat facility. I'd like now to introduce Simon Martin-Redman. He is a fellow of the Royal Philatelic Society London. He was elected to fellowship in 2012. He's a past president of the Sarawak Specialist Society and has a leading collection of Sarawak postal history. Therefore, Martin, I know you're ready and waiting, and it's a great pleasure for me to hand over to you to present your display of Sarawak postal history. Thank you very much indeed.
Right, I'm going to start now. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and a happy Thanksgiving to all our American friends, American cousins. I know a few of you have joined, and I'm very pleased that friends of mine, especially Steve Schumann, who I know it's very early in the morning for you, Steve, out in the on the west coast of America. Sarawak has been a love of mine for many, many years. Just for those of you that don't know, it occupies the northwestern seaboard of the island of Borneo and covers an area of about 50,000 square miles, the majority of which is rainforest. And to the northeast lies British North Borneo, now Sabah, Brunei and Labuan. The remainder of the country borders with Indonesian Borneo. The capital is Kuching, and originally, and when my story begins, Kuching was Sarawak. The climate is that of the rainforest, with the average temperature of Sarawak at 85 degrees and humidity at 94%. The tropical climate causes real problems to philatelists, as the quality of material is a real problem, with stamps very difficult to find in good condition. I also collect postal stationery, and whilst early examples unused are virtually impossible to find, when you do find them, they're usually in very, very poor condition due to foxing. So my presentation this afternoon, Pirates, Population and Post, will tell the swashbuckling story of early Sarawak and the introduction of the post. Here's a picture of the first Raja, James Brooke, painted in 1848. A scarce, if not unique, personally signed copy. The quotation on the right, "If it please God to permit me to give a stamp to this country, which shall last after I am no more, I shall have lived a life which emperors might envy." Words written by Sir James Brooke at his home in Barata and Sheepstore, Devon, shortly before he died. Romantically, one could wish that he was talking about a postage stamp, but unfortunately he was not. James Brooke, after being invalided out of the East India Company, he discovered a love of the Far East. And after his father died in 1835, he left him £30,000, which he bought a schooner, the Royalist, which was armed with 6-pounder guns. He initially set sail for Singapore, but once there, he carried on to Kuching. At the time, the whole of Sarawak was under the rule of the Sultan of Brunei and governed by a man called Mahkota, an unprincipled and grasping dictator. The local population were Malays and Dyaks. Dyaks are headhunters, and were in open revolt, and piracy was rife, mainly from the Sea Dyaks. The Sultan sent his uncle, Raja Muda Hassim, to restore order. He struggled, but in 1839, James Brooke dropped anchor and made a deep impression on Hassim and agreed to help him. It was not that easy though, and Brooke took time to bring the rebels under control, and by doing so, he had the indigenous peoples of Sarawak behind him. But he tired of Hassim and threatened to depart. Hassim grew desperate, and to entice Brooke to stay, he offered him the province of Sarawak, its government, its revenues, and its trade. And on September the 24th, 1841, and from that day forward, Brooke became Raja. He continued to be in constant battles with the pirates, which caused many problems between him and the government of England at a later date. Nominally, he remained the feudal lord of the Sultan until 5 years later in 1846, he had secured a deed of absolute sovereignty and became Sarawak's absolute ruler. Sarawak continued to be privately ruled by the Brooke family for nigh on 100 years until the Japanese invaded in 1941. It was unique insofar it was the only Muslim country in the world ruled by Christian monarchs with hereditary successors and direct personal rule. My title of my presentation involves population, and there are many references to population in history books. Emily Hahn's biography of James Brooke actually lists by name the 16 Europeans in the country in 1843, and over half of those 16 were crew members of the Royalist. Criswell's biography of Charles Brooke states that the European community was less than a score in 1870, with the civil service numbers about the same. The graph shows the number of officers in the Raja's civil service, and that's all gained from historical records. And the table on the right is taken from a population survey published in the Sarawak Gazette, dated 16th of February in 1912. These civil service figures do not include personal staff, such as the Raja's groom, maids, or junior officers on the yacht, nor does it include missionary and civilian traders. It would be safe to add a factor of about 2.5, which extrapolated means in 1890, about 80 Europeans in the country, which correlates across to the population survey of 1891. To reiterate, nearly all the Europeans were in the Raja's government service, and by 1910, there were still only 112 Europeans. And even by the time the Japanese invaded in 1941, there were about only 200 Europeans living in Sarawak. It was remarkable that the Brookes actually set up a government with such a small number of men. Furthermore, from a philatelic point of view, it is therefore unsurprising that the early postal history from Sarawak is exceptionally scarce and incoming virtually non-existent. The presentation will show how the early postal service evolved, which, as I've already said, was amazing considering the small number of administrators. And after James Brooke settled in Sarawak, a post office of sorts was instituted. Unfortunately, no record of when this took place has survived, as all government records were destroyed in the Chinese insurrection in Kuching in February 1857. But it seems fairly certain that it commenced before this. The two covers shown show the first ever council, the Post Office Sarawak, and those are also dated in manuscript. So we now know that the post office was definitely in existence in January 1858, because the top cover is the earliest cover known, dated 26th of January 1858 to Scotland. The next earliest cover, 31st of May 1858, is also shown there. There were only 4 covers, pre-stamped covers known, and 3 were in my collection. But about 8 years ago, a further cover was discovered in France of all places, and I shall come on to that again later. These covers bore no stamp in accordance with the post office notice you see on the left, and were sent bearing. Both covers are marked with manuscript 6s, showing that the amount of 6 annas was due. The reason why annas were due is that the postal arrangements of the Strait settlements were under the control of India. And in 1854, the post offices of Singapore, Penang and Malacca were in the Bengal Circle under the direction of the Postmaster General of Bengal. Around the middle of 1858, the government of Sarawak entered into an agreement with the postal authorities in Singapore regarding mail between Sarawak and Singapore and onward transmission for destinations further afield. No specific details are known, but from January 1859, all letters addressed to destinations beyond Singapore are franked with adhesive stamps then in use in Singapore. So therefore, from 1859, East India stamps were used in Singapore and Sarawak for correspondence addressed to places beyond Singapore. And to facilitate this arrangement, a supply of East India stamps was, at some unknown date, sent to Kuching. And it is known that Sarawak was one of the first countries to take advantage of such a facility. This cover is the second earliest cover known bearing these stamps and the only cover known at the 4 cents rate. The earliest cover known bearing those stamps is January 1859, and this is July. Again, a recently discovered cover in the last 7 or 8 years, and again from France. The cover's addressed to Mrs. Harvey, and Mr. Harvey at the time was a managing director of the Borneo Company in Sarawak. During the period 1859 to 1867, only 25 covers exist from Sarawak bearing East India stamps. But of those 25 covers, they're also collected by Straits Settlements collectors and India collectors. And they're all franked at varying rates. This is because the rate from Singapore to England varied from time to time as the Indian rate altered. It is further complicated by the fact that there were 2 shipping lanes operating a mail service from Singapore. The Peninsula and Oriental Steam Navigation Company running from Shanghai to Southampton, and, excuse my French, the Compagnie de Messageries Maritimes running from Shanghai to Marseille. This particular cover is franked at 4 annas to Singapore plus a 6 annas Marseille rate in use from February 1857. It is from the Raja Muda. The Raja Muda is the heir apparent. He was called Brooke, and it was sent to his parents, Reverend Johnson. And the Reverend Johnson's wife was Raja James Brooke's sister. And here you can see, and you'll see as we go on, that many of the letters appertaining to these covers are in the Brooke archives, and I show the letter that's in that cover on the right-hand side. I've been very fortunate that I've had access to the Brooke archives for a couple of years now, and they are held in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And I now know, as a result of that, the content of at least 75% of my covers, if only I could have the actual letters. All the previous covers I've shown have the Post Office Sarawak Council being used as a dispatch mark. This cover shows the first use of the Post Office Sarawak cancelling the stamps, again at the 10 anna rate. As I said, there were 25 covers known from Sarawak bearing East India stamps, and the majority of these are to Angela Burdett Coates, and they are from the first Raja, James Brooke. A couple are to Reverend Johnson, as you saw earlier, his brother-in-law, and the father of both Brooke and Charles Brooke, who became the second Raja. Of those 25 covers, 8 are in my exhibit. In many of his letters to the Baroness, there are glimpses of a relationship more intimate than pure friendship. And interestingly, that Burdett Coates never married until after his death. He too also never married. And at the time, she was the richest woman in England. And the Raja was very short of money, and he borrowed £5,000 from Miss Coates to help him run the country at the beginning. To illustrate that amount, at that time, the largest coin in use in Sarawak was a 1 cent coin, and the largest note in use was 25 cents. Both these covers are via Marseille, and they show the change of the postal rate in 1863 from 10 annas to 10 annas 8 pies. A strange story. This is a council that shouldn't be on stamps at all. It's the Office of Registry Council. This council is found authenticating Treasury notes in 1858, and those notes themselves are very rare. This is the earliest banknote known, and even though it is in a disgusting condition, it is worth nearly as much as the cover. Due to its similarity to the Post Office Sarawak hand stamp, it was used by mistake to cancel mail on a very few occasions. At that time, the Treasury, the Land Registry and the Postal Counter would have all been in the same room and probably with the same junior officer carrying out a number of functions. You can imagine if you had a few too many libations the night before, you could quite easily the following morning mistaken the cancel. Only 3 covers are known with this officer of registry cancel, and 2 have the same arrival date in London. And 1 is a month later, and he must have made the same mistake again. 1 is to Miss Brown, Angela Burdett-Coutts' companion, and this is to Miss Burdett-Coutts herself. And all 3 of the known covers are from the Rajah. Advice wanted. It was pointed out to me earlier that of all the 25 covers known, this is the only one known that has the Via Marseille cachet in blue. And I don't think it was put on in Sarawak, as none of the other covers known have it. The other cover sent on the same day by the Rajah to Miss Brooke's companion does not have this cachet. So why this cover has it, I have no idea. And if anybody does know, please let me know. This is the first use of the Sarawak 9-bar cancel. Note the Post Office Sarawak cancel goes back to being used as a dispatch mark in the bottom left-hand corner. This cover is dated 1864. It's also possibly the earliest cover known from Labuan as well, as it's from Bishop MacDougall, who was the Bishop of Labuan, and he wrote on the back flap that he was in Labuan at the time, but as there was no post service, he would post it when he got back to Kuching. I make no excuse for this cover, apart from the fact of all the 25 covers known, I consider this cover to be the finest of all of them. It's cancelled at the correct rate of 10 annas, 8 pies, and the beautiful 3-colour franking, and it's still so fresh, again from the Rajah to Miss Coutts. It's one of the favourite pieces in my whole collection. This is a wonderful historical and philatelic item dated May the 18th, 1868, and it depicts 2 lithographic proofs of the first stamp of Sarawak. It's from A.C. Cruikshank, secretary to the Sarawak government at the time, and it's addressed to Charles Brooke, the 2nd Rajah, or about to be the 2nd Rajah. Cruikshank was staying with the 1st Rajah at his house in Devon, and the 1st Rajah died just a month later on the 11th of June. The letter talks about the production of the 1st issue, and as I said, it has the 2 lithographic proofs, black on yellow, attached. It says in the letter, "What do you think of the stamps? The shape of the head is very like, all but the eyes, which are too dark, and this will be rectified in printing off. These are just the first impression." So why then was this stamp issued bearing the 1st Rajah's portrait and not that of Charles Brooke? Well, it may well be that it was to honour his memory, but more probably, with Sarawak being so impoverished, the considerable expense and time incurred in the production and printing of the stamps, the stock of stamps they had could not be wasted. Remember, there were still less than 20 officers running the country at the time. This engraved die proof of the 1st stamp of Sarawak, there's only 3 die proofs known, one of which is in the Royal Collection. And it's of the stamp which was issued on March the 1st, 1869, of 3 cents denomination. And as I said, it bore a portrait bust of Sir James Brooke, despite the fact that he had died some 9 months earlier. Rajah Sir James Brooke reigned from 1842 until the 11th of June, 1868, when he was succeeded by Sir Charles Brooke. The stamp was printed lithographically by McClure, MacDonald and McGregor of 37 Walbrook, London and Glasgow, who printed this 1st issue. They had previously printed the 1866 issue of Uruguay, but that's the only record I have of them printing any stamp before that. The engraved die proof of the finished design has the initials JBRS for James Brooke, Rajah of Sarawak. And the die was engraved by William Ridgway. No genuine cover exists of this 1st issue. And considering the stamp was in such a short time, less than 2 years, it is surprising how many used copies are actually known. Perhaps due to the fact that a used copy is worth £200 more than an unused copy. Having a Singapore cancel gives one more faith that they're genuine stamps. You'll see on the left 2 pieces, and there are only actually 5 pieces known. As I said, no genuine cover and only 5 pieces known bearing that first stamp of Sarawak. We now come to the second stamp of Sarawak, and the first bearing the portrait of the second Raja, Sir Charles Brooke. The finished die proof is mounted on die sunk card, and only 2 examples are known of this die proof. The other example is in the Royal Collection. This time the initials are CBRS for Charles Brooke, Raja of Sarawak. And like the first issue, the die was engraved by William Ridgway. No exact date of issue is known, but it must have been around early January 1871, as an order was issued by the Raja on January the 23rd, stating no more of the old stamps are to be issued, and the old stamps would be null and void after 31st of March 1871. Those that possess old stamps can exchange them for new ones. The stamp was again printed by McClure, MacDonald and McGregor. It's worth mentioning here that Charles Brooke was a superb administrator, and the prosperity of Sarawak and the efficiency of the government was primarily down to him. However, he too had issues with pirates and had to put down a few pirate insurrections in the early years of his rule. From 1869 until the late 1880s, this period of Sarawak's history is marked by great achievements in social conditions. Revenues became buoyant, imports and exports continually rose, roads were built, as well as many fine buildings. Schools were open, agriculture expanded, mineral deposits exploited and missions founded. And most importantly, post offices were opened. And all with a government consisting of less than 30 officers. During Charles's reign of 49 years, Sarawak became a sort of laboratory for the development of methods of government suited to indigenous peoples. Many methods originating from these times were widely adopted around the world with success elsewhere. This cover is the earliest cover known bearing a Sarawak adhesive. And although Sarawak had issued its own stamp since March 1st, 1869, they were only valid for use internally and to Singapore only. For destinations outside Singapore, the straight settlement stamps had to be used in combination. And this practice continued until Sarawak joined the Universal Postal Union on July 1st, 1897. Serendipitously, Mark Bailey had undertaken research on this chap, as he too had a cover addressed to him. He was a successful linen manufacturer based in Dunfermline, who expanded to the USA. But more importantly to us, he was a philatelist and an early member of the Royal, joining in 1892 and became the Royal Scottish representative. So thank you, Mark, for telling me about Mr. Beveridge. Knowing this, I can now assume that the cover was probably written by Noel Denison, the postmaster of Sarawak, at the time of its sending. The Sarawak Gazette reported in 1875 that a new postal convention was arranged in 1874 between Sarawak and the Straits Settlement, fixing the rates of postage and introducing a registration fee of 6 cents for the first time. This cover, cancelled at the correct registration rate, plus the other rates, 4-ounce rate to the UK of $2.36. So it's also the earliest known registration cover. And only 2 complete covers are known with that paid cancellation, the paid you can see in the top right-hand corner on the 12-cent stamp. To this day, no one is quite sure what this paid cancellation was used for. It's only known on the 1871 and 1875 issues, and some have thought it was a receiving mark from outstations. Others have thought it was a fiscal cancel for receipts and for other documents, but I don't think so. I believe it to be the first and the early registration cancel. However, it goes to show that even now there are still philatelic mysteries that need answering. I mentioned there are only 2 covers known with a paid cancellation. This is the second of the 2 covers. In addition, only 2 covers are known from Sarawak stating via Brindisi, and this is at the correct rate of Brindisi of 16 cents plus the 3-cent Sarawak stamp. The other Brindisi, via Brindisi cover is also in my collection, and both are addressed to Italian addresses. There is a third cover that we know went via Brindisi, but it didn't state it on the cover. To carry on my hypothesis about registration council, this is the first proper registration council known. It actually says registration council, the three-tiered boxed registration council. It was the first registration council known with registration on of Sarawak. And when it came into use, it's not really known, although it is first seen on this issue, but rarely on that particular stamp. Forrester Wood stated that it was first recorded in 1884, but this proves otherwise. Probably late 1870s, as I have a 3-cent stamp in my collection dated 1879 with this council. This is also the only cover known with the Sarawak Post Office registration, box registration council on it. But why, if the registration rate was 6 cents, why is there no extra stamps paying that registration fee of 6 cents? I'm still trying to find that one out. During the 1870s, the import and export trade of Sarawak had reached 1.68 billion Singapore dollars. Raja Charles Brooke realised that because of the steady increases in trade, there was a need for a multiracial body to advise the government on commercial matters. Thus, in May 1873, he formed the Sarawak Chamber of Commerce. The major problem the members of this chamber faced was shipping. The government steamer had become the sole link with Singapore. The Raja urged them to form their own shipping company to cope with the increasing trade. And in a step the first Raja would never have supported, he offered to sell them his ship, the Royalist. His offer was accepted, and in 1875, in August of 1875, the Singapore and Sarawak Steamship Company was inaugurated. The new shareholders were predominantly Chinese merchants of Kuching, and especially the sago exporters. The Borneo Company also participated and acted as managers. And in 1877, they ordered and had built in Great Britain the ship, the Raja Brooke. And this wonderful cover is actually the earliest cover known bearing a ship name. And you can see on the top left, it says per the Raja Brooke. This cover is probably from a chap called Commander Malcolm Drummond. He'd only just arrived in Sarawak, which would explain the unique usage of this particular straight settlement stamp, 10 cents on 30 cents. It's the only copy known from Sarawak. And it's probably been used because I found out he probably bought it with him from Singapore, as he'd only been in the country for 6 weeks before he sent this cover. This cover also went via Brindisi, but it doesn't say so on the cover itself, but it was rated at the correct rate. Now, I'm meant to be the leading authority on early covers from Sarawak, and I've known for a while that covers bearing the 1871 issue and the 1875 issue were very scarce. But it's only while researching for this presentation that I realised how scarce, which endorses the adage that one should exhibit or present, as you always learn more by doing so. They're actually more scarce than the early ones, the previous East India covers, mainly because Burdett Coutts kept most of her correspondence. Between 1871 and 1888, I reckon there's approximately only 20 covers known. I would like to say, when I was exhibiting at Singapore in 2015, a judge criticised me for not displaying any internal covers. I had to point out to him that there are no internal covers known in the 19th century, as the Sarawak officers themselves would send unfranked letters backwards and forwards via boats. Now, this covers for my American friends that are watching today. USS Brooklyn. It was posted from an officer from the USS Brooklyn. And the Brooklyn was the first of a 5-screw sloops of war that were authorized by Congress on the 3rd of March, 1857. The Brooklyn was used in the American Civil War and took part in the capture of Mobile, Alabama, and the combined attack on Fort Morgan in 1864. But her last service was an extensive cruise to Asiatic waters, between 1886 and 1889. And after accessing the US naval records, I found that USS Brooklyn sailed from New York on the 12th of August, 1886 for duty in the Orient, calling briefly at Sarawak early 1887. And it's addressed to a Bonsall, and the Bonsall family were one of the most respected families in Philadelphia and wealthy families in Philadelphia at the time. So this cover almost certainly came from one of the ship's officers, but a wonderful find for me. On the 22nd of August 1887, a meeting was held to consider the whole question of postal arrangements in Sarawak. It was chaired by the Raja and included the Postmaster General and the Treasurer and the Resident, and representatives from both local community and Chinese merchants. Postal regulations hadn't changed since 1869, and regulations had become relaxed, and many letters were being carried by native boats without being stamped, which could explain the extreme scarcity of material. It was agreed that a properly organised postal system was necessary and beneficial. And the rate for half-ounce letters had remained at 3 cents since 1869, but this meeting reduced it to 2 cents, with other rates being a multiple of 2 cents. So this led to a greatly increased demand for a 2-cent stamp, and therefore an order was placed with De La Rue Company for this and 6 other denominations. I'm showing here 3 exceptionally important and unique artist hand-painted essays for that 2-cent stamp, and the bottom one personally approved by Raja Charles Brooke. Remember that there were still only 30 government officers at this time and probably less than 50 Europeans in the country in total. I'm now going to skip on 20 years to the early 1900s. By 1900, Sarawak had expanded in territory and gradually outstations were introduced, usually manned by a junior officer who undertook all administrative functions, including that of postmaster, and in many cases would be the only European there. Some of these outstations were in very remote locations in the rainforest, consisting of a few longhouses and tin huts. Many were only accessible by boat. However, meticulous records and accounts were expected to be kept, and if only they'd survived. So in 1910, there were 29 post offices opened in the country, but still only 112 European men in the country. Some of those cancellations must be some of the scarcest post office cancellations in the world, and I shall illustrate. Here we have some cancellations from Daro, a small outstation located about 30 miles northeast of Cebu, near the mouth of one of the tributaries of the Sungai Rijang River. The area is mainly mangrove swamp. The Postal Service is stated to have commenced in October 1911, but the earliest known cancellation is this one, 1918. The only records of stamp sales are for 1922, which were nil, and in 1923, 8 cents worth of stamps were sold. As I said before, officers were expected to keep meticulous records, and that included a handwritten ledger of all letters sent, i.e. from whom and to whom. And again, if only those ledgers still existed. Tatau, where this is from, is situated about 20 miles southwest of Bintulu. The Sarawak Gazette of 1919 records that in 1918, only 26 letters were dispatched, but stamps to the value of $8.52 were sold. So it was probably the home of some unknown philatelist. This cover is sent to Hart Lovelace, who actually sent these covers to each of the outstations that were recorded in 1918-1919 to be cancelled and returned to him. The editor of the Sarawak Gazette at the time, J.C. Swain, also did the same, and I think they did it in conjunction with each other. Unfortunately, J.C. Swain cut his examples from the cover. You saw 2 previously on the Daro example. Without them undertaking this exercise, we would not have any examples of the rare post offices that we do have. This one, Simatan, is a small kampong 40 miles northwest of Kuching. It's believed to have started a postal service in the 1900s and closed about 1920. The Sarawak Gazette of 1919 states it's in the unique position of having sold no stamps at all in 1918. It is the scarcest of all Sarawak postmarks, with this being the only copy known from that post office. It is therefore not only the Sarawak's scarcest post office and scarcest cancellation, it must be the scarcest cancellation in the world, with only one known. Belingian is a relatively small, isolated outstation about 10 miles up the Sungai Kakus River and 30 miles east of Muka. The inhabitants are mainly Dyaks, Melanals. Although there are stamp sales of 62 cents, about 8p, recorded for 1919, up until the discovery of this cover, there were no record of any postal cancellation known until 1931. I discovered this cover, and besides being the earliest known cover from Belingian by some 16 years, it is also a very scarce First World War censor cover from Sarawak, which is just unbelievable. Again, one of my favourite covers. I'm now going to show a few incoming covers to finish with, because, as I said, these are actually scarcer than the outgoing covers. Raja James Brooke became the ruler of Sarawak in 1841. This cover is addressed to Captain Bethune, Royal Navy, to Borneo or elsewhere, Singapore. I spent a long time researching this cover. It is documented in Admiral Keppel's book, The Expedition to Borneo of HMS Dido, 1843 to 1846, also in Captain Mundy's book about the Raja, and Spencer St. John's book about Raja Brooke, that Bethune arrived in Kuching, Sarawak in February 1845. We know that mail took 2 to 3 months to get to Sarawak, and this cover was posted in February 1845. I also knew that Bethune painted a picture of the Raja Brooke's bungalow, and after accessing the records at Yale University, I established that this picture had been painted in July 1845, which placed him in Sarawak at that time. I can therefore state categorically that this is the earliest cover known either into or from Sarawak. This cover is from India in 1851 and is the earliest incoming cover actually addressed to Sarawak. And it's addressed to William Brereton, who arrived in Sarawak at the tender age of 15. And he was the son of Reverend C.D. Brereton, who was a relation of James Brooke. Brereton came to Sarawak as a midshipman, but later decided to leave the Navy and join Brooke in 1848. Brereton was also the great nephew of the Bishop of Calcutta, and this letter from Calcutta is almost certainly written by the bishop. And as I said, it's the earliest incoming cover known with Sarawak actually on the envelope. This cover is also addressed to Brereton. Do you remember a few months back that Carl Louis, and I forget the chap's name, so please forgive me if he's watching, I did a superb joint presentation on mixed frankings. And I contacted Carl Louis afterwards, and Carl Louis said he only had 2 covers listed from Sarawak, from GB into Sarawak. And I sent in copies of the ones I had. This covers franked at the Indian close rate of 1 shillings and 10p. And William Brereton, this young man that arrived at the age of 15, was the first European officer ever to be stationed outside Kuching. And at the age of 20, was dispatched to Scrang Fort. And he lived at Scrang Fort for nearly 3 years without any other European officer nearby. However, he did take a native wife, which probably did help him through the lonely nights. After 3 years, he was sent an assistant Lee, who lost his life fairly quickly after arrival in a skirmish with the Scrang Iban pirates, those damn pirates again. Brereton died in 1854, aged 24, from dysentery, and is buried in the Brooke Cemetery in Kuching, and I've had the honour to have visited his grave. This cover is franked at the scarce GB 11p rate, which was only in use for 15 days. Scarce for GB collectors, but to Sarawak as well, wow, very rare. It's addressed to Mrs. Charles Grant, wife of the Raja Brooke's private secretary, Charles Grant. And Charles was the eldest son of the Laird of Kilgaraston, whose seat was in the Bridge of Erne, from where this letter was sent. In the early days, letters to Sarawak were sent via Singapore, care of an agent. And this letter would have been carried from Singapore to Sarawak, either in one of the company's boats or in the Raja's private schooner. Again, another letter to Mrs. Charles Grant. There's a common denominator here why these particular covers have survived, as Brooke, who you'll see in a minute, Grant, and even Brereton, sadly, all those possessions would have gone back home with them after only spending a limited time in Sarawak, hence little tropicalisation. This letter was posted from England at 15th of May 1857. In February 1857, I've already mentioned there was a Chinese insurrection, and Charles Grant was in charge of the fort at Belladar. This letter was probably written straight after news of the insurrection reached England. Sixpence rate versus Southampton, but it's also franked by an extremely rare 1856 sixpence pale lilac on azure paper, and very few examples of this distinctive stamp are known on cover. Many of you would have seen this cover written up in the London Philatelist. Absolutely amazing cover. It's the only known surviving cover addressed to the first Rajah of Sarawak. All his early correspondence was destroyed by fire during the Chinese uprising, and all his later correspondence now resides in the Bodleian Library, but none of the covers. It was on eBay, and I was in India on holiday at the time in Rajasthan, and I knew just how rare and important it was, so I put a Skype bid on this. I would suggest that my Skype bid may well have been the highest Skype bid ever received for a philatelic item on eBay. As you can see, I won it, and thankfully very few others realised its significance. It's a part letter from Mr. J. Williamson, who I believe was the father of Thomas Williamson. And Thomas came to Sarawak in the Royalists in 1839 and served as the Rajah's interpreter and for a short time his Prime Minister before drowning on the 29th of January 1846. So why has this cover survived? Probably due to that little bit of manuscript at the bottom of the cover, which says to be sent to Dogood. Now, Dogood was at the time the manager of the Borneo Company based in Kuching. So the Rajah probably sent in this to him for him to reply to the letter on his behalf. And that would have been in Dogood's possession on his return to the UK, cancelled at a very scarce private ship rate of 8p. This 1862 cover was cancelled at the 1 3 rate, which was only in use for 10 months. The Rajah had tried to sell Sarawak to Great Britain, but there was not a political appetite for it in Great Britain at the time. I also know after research that he also tried to sell it to France and even tried to sell Sarawak to Belgium. Imagine if he had sold it to Belgium. You might have had Patrick Marcellis giving this display. This strategy did not go down at all well with his heir, Brooke. And whilst the Rajah was in England, he tried to overthrow the Rajah. James Brooke disinherited him, and the throne, so to speak, passed on to Brooke's brother, Charles Brooke. So this letter to the Rajah Mudda, Brooke, is from the Rajah, James Brooke, and is almost certainly the reply to the letter written by Brooke on the 28th of October, which was the start of this crisis, which culminated in his disinheritance. In his very unwise and defiant letter of the 26th of October, he announced to Rajah James Brooke that he assumed the government of the country and would defend his rights by force. The Rajah could not accept such defiance and, accompanied by his other nephew Charles, stormed out to Singapore and met Brooke there in February, and he dismissed him immediately with ignominy. Brooke hoped his brother Charles would be loyal to him, but it was not so. Charles supplanted him as Rajah Mudda and afterwards ruled as Rajah from 1868 to 1917. It was a good job though, as Charles was a superb ruler, and as I've mentioned already, and primarily responsible for the success of Sarawak, supported by so few Europeans. This particular cover I bought from the Gilbert Wheat sale. It was Gilbert Wheat's favourite cover, and it was on the cover of the auction catalogue from Cavendish a few years ago. Another cover to illustrate that a few of the covers in my presentation today needed much research to determine the recipient was in Sarawak at the time. Especially the earliest cover, which I've shown you from Captain Bethune, and now this cover to Lieutenant Pascoe, dated 1851. From my research, I know that HM Brig Royalist was off the coast of Sarawak, Borneo at this time. Letters to Singapore were sent at the India rate in 1851, and this was a shilling from Southampton. I believe it to be sent by Admiral Pascoe to his son, Lieutenant Crawford Pascoe. Admiral Pascoe was most famous for when he was a young officer, he was a signal lieutenant to Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar, and he would have had the responsibility for hoisting the famous signal which began, "England expects that every man would do his duty." And lastly, a royal display needs a royal cover. This final item in my presentation is an illustrated cover from the Royal Philatelic Society Stamp Centenary Exhibition in aid of the Red Cross and St John Fund, dated May 1940. Even then, the Royal was looking to raise funds. And I thought this a very apt way to end this exhibit. And I know that it may not be a scarce cover normally, but you find me another one to Sarawak. And that's it, folks. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Simon. If you'd like to stop
Yes, I've
sharing.
unmuted.
If you'd like to stop sharing your screen, thank you very much. And so back to you, Richard.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. Simon, I really do have to express my sincere appreciation to you for a magnificent display, brilliantly presented, on the subject of the development of postal services in Sarawak. It contains so many really fascinating and interesting items, and thank you most sincerely for all the work that you've put into it. I won't say any more because I know that later Peter Coburn will be speaking, but at this stage of the afternoon, we then now invite those in attendance, and we now have 148 attendees who have listened to your and seen your presentation. We have 10 people in the chat room, and the way we manage this is that I now hand back to Mark, and he handles the asking of the questions. Mark, over to you.
Thank you very much. I will do exactly that. And I think the first question that I saw, which I think is just a straightforward one, really. Melanie asks, Simon, did Sarawak have its own currency?
Yes, I showed you the first banknote known, which was basically just done on a piece of cardboard and done by virtually a John Bull printing press. But then later on, it had its own currency coins. The first coin was a 1 cent coin, and then gradually other coins were made, and banknotes, which were printed by both Perkins Bacon and De La Rue. And they are phenomenally valuable, the early notes of Sarawak. Very, very, very valuable items.
Presumably because they're rarity. Yeah,
yes.
Yeah, very rare now.
I mean, very, very few in any condition survive.
Yeah. Okay.
A serendipitous point. One of the banknotes of Sarawak later on in that the late 30s, early 40s, was signed by a man called Bert Treckman, and Bert Treckman at the time was the treasurer of Sarawak. Now, my eldest son James met a girl in Australia called Susie Treckman, and it turns out that her great uncle was Bert Treckman, the treasurer of Sarawak. How serendipitous is that?
Very good. Very good. Right. Well, thank you for that. Now, Stephen Parkin asked a question about that first registered Sarawak mark. You explained about the fact that the registration fee didn't seem to have been paid by stamps. So he asked the question, could the registration fee have been paid in cash?
It may well have done. There were no records to suggest it, and whether we'll ever know, but it could well have been, yes.
Okay. Patrick Miselis is rather surprised and asked the question, why did the Raja open and keep open all those post offices which were costing a fortune and did not generate revenue?
Because they weren't actually a post office as such. There would have been one officer who was the resident, the postmaster, the land agent, the police officer, the judge. One person would have done everything. And so it was effectively a post office, and it had a post office cancellation, but there was no extra cost. One man did everything.
Right. Okay.
No staff, just one handwritten ledger.
Yeah, just one person doing all of the things that needed doing.
And woe betide them, and I do know this from historic records, woe betide if they got their accounting wrong, even by 1 or 2 cents. I mean, the Raja was a stickler, the second Raja, Charles Brooke, absolute stickler for probity and looking after cash.
You mentioned the book on mixed frankings. Yeah, Carl Louis wrote that in conjunction with Ray Simpson.
Yeah.
Melanie asks, which issue of the London Flat List has the article on that cover to Sir James Brooke?
It would have been in the last year. When Tony Bard first started doing cover stories, so it had been early last year.
Okay. With regard to the point you were making about the fact that the country was offered for sale to Belgium, Patrick has pointed out that the Belgian king got a green light from the Dutch in 1861 to do whatever he liked in the northern parts of Borneo. So clearly this was something that was of interest at the time between the Belgians and the Dutch and the Raja.
And there was a real problem with the Dutch. They didn't want the Dutch to have any more influence out there, and I think that is part of the reason that it didn't happen.
And Bryant Corn is just emphasising the point as you've already made. It places such as Sarawak, clearly jungle countries, the lack of covers and the lack of internal covers. So it's very important that we emphasize the fact that material from these sorts of countries is generally very scarce. And I know that was a point you were making in your remark about the judging. Yeah,
it's also I'm very pleased that the law of economics works at supply and demand, and the value is correlated by demand. That some of these covers, as I said, are the only ones known. And you and I have spoken, Mark, that an 1847 USA cover sold a couple of weeks ago for $550,000 US, and an inverted Jenny sells for silly money, and there's 100 of them. I started collecting Sarawak as a young naval officer with 3 kids at school, and the reason I collected Sarawak at the beginning was I could do just purely stamps, 1 to SG 220, and I could afford it, on my naval officer's salary.
Yes. Anyway, at the moment, that looks to me to be the last question. So I think, Richard, I'd like to hand back to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. It's my pleasure now to invite our President-elect, Peter Coburn, to present the vote of thanks on behalf of everyone attending this presentation. Peter, over to you.
Well, thank you, President, very much indeed. It's been a great afternoon, and anyone in England now abed will curse the day they were not here. The wonderful thing about Simon is that in the pictures early on, there was a portrait of a strapping young man, looking altogether a very successful businessman. Now today, he's looking much more like the Admiral Keppel effect, by having a fine beard. And of course, I imagine that he goes to sleep at night wondering on which tack he's going to take HMS Dido with the Raja on board into Kuching Harbour. And of course, hoping that he might pick up a few snippets of correspondence on the way. But seriously, Simon has given us a wonderful resume of the early days of this most extraordinary country. There are very few geographical areas in the world that were run entirely by one man or one family. And I think it's reasonable to say that Sarawak was probably one of the most successful. The material he's shown us is also extremely remarkable. I mean, I've been a member of the Sarawak Specialist Society, which is the specialist society which covers this area, for I think 50 years next year. And I've seen a lot of material from Sarawak, but I've never seen some of the covers that he's shown today. They are on view for all of us, almost, I think, for the very first time. And that's a huge privilege. The material is very scarce. It's very interesting. And there's no doubt at all that Simon has put a huge amount of effort into the research that has gone on, that he's done, both here in England, in Oxford, and overseas, to produce a story which is just riveting. There were 29 post offices in Sarawak in 1910. There were only 7 in North Borneo nearby. But I think the reason for that was explained by him, in that it was they were also the district offices, and each of them had, in the case of Sarawak, they had their own council and hence became a post office. In Sabah, in North Borneo, they were district offices, and the marks you find on the stamps there are usually district office stamps, so they're not post offices. So that's just a little anecdote in that direction. But it does seem to me that we've had a trawl through the greatest material that is available for the country of Sarawak. It's been presented in a most cogent and interesting way, and we've had an insight into just what a real philatelist is capable of doing, given a bit of time, a few shillings, and the experience and keenness to be able to go and do it. And I think that's a wonderful demonstration of what philately is all about for all of us. Simon, I must thank you very, very much indeed, for myself and on behalf of all the members, not just the 150 or so who are watching today, but all of the members of the Royal from all over the world, because you're the sort of person who gives the Royal a great reputation. And we are extremely grateful to you, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I'm very much obliged to you for that vote of thanks. I think you've reflected the views of everybody who has seen this magnificent presentation this afternoon. I note that you didn't comment on the fact that Simon wasn't wearing a bow tie, and also that some of the covers aren't in the wrong collection. But Mark, you have
Yes.
the next bit of virtual presentation, and that is the certificate, I believe.
I do indeed. I will just put that on screen.
Simon, as a memento of your display this afternoon, we do present you with a certificate. It's not only the virtual example, you will receive the real thing in the next few days, hopefully, subject to Royal Mail, through the post. And this is a permanent record of today's magnificent presentation. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, Simon, ladies and gentlemen, that completes the formal part of the presentation and this afternoon's meeting. We will remain on air for discussion to take place. The only announcement I would make at this stage is that I am adopting a dual approach to the rest of my program for the 2020-21 period up to the annual general meeting. And although most of the meetings are now in place, subject to the government restrictions which have been announced today, we have to examine exactly what we're able to do at 15 Abchurch Lane. But hopefully by early next week, we will be in a position to provide further advice. There will, however, be another President's newsletter distributed tomorrow. We're having to, because of the changes that are taking place, I'm having to do this on an almost weekly basis at the moment. But fortunately, it will be short on this occasion. However, as a precaution, I am looking for further virtual presentations, which will be presented if there are further cancellations of physical displays due to be held at 15 Abchurch Lane. The next 2 presentations will be on the 3rd and on the 10th of December, and they are much shorter presentations by 5 on the 3rd and 6 members of council who have very kindly agreed to display the lighter side of postal history and philately, and also there will be some items with a festive theme. And I do look forward to meet many of you attending those meetings, and hopefully we will move into a period after that where things can be a little bit more certain. But I think we've just got to plan for every eventuality at the moment. May I take this opportunity to thank everybody for attending what has been a magnificent presentation this afternoon, and I look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you all very much indeed.
Richard?
Yes?
I think Frank would like to make mention of a new publication. Is that okay?
Yes, of course it is. Yes. I will be including information about that in the newsletter tomorrow, but Frank, yes, if he would like to mention it now, by all means. Thank you,
Richard. The Royals been slaving away producing a brand new publication, which was actually available as of yesterday. Richard will mention it tomorrow in his newsletter, but you can actually click on the website today and order it. It's in stock and available to order. The subject is Pan American Transatlantic Airmail for World War II, Censorship and the Lati Substitute. It's a new story, and I do hope everybody will look on the website and see what it's all about. It's also a break for convention for the Royal. It's the first time we've ever done an aerophilatelic book.
Ah. Thank you, Frank.
I should just like to mention, because I know some people joined the meeting a little bit later, as in after it had started, I'd like to just mention that we will be making a recording of this and putting it on YouTube, so that people can always look at it again if they missed the early part of the presentation, for example.
Certainly.
All right.
Yes, that's fine.
And I think we've reached the point where it's probably time to stop the recording. So I'm going to do that now.
Yes.